Well, welcome to the second day of GFN 21, brought to you live here from Liverpool and also broadcast globally by GFN TV. We've had over 1,000 people registered for the conference from nearly 90 countries. So once again, GFN is a success, even though we've adapted it to these new COVID times. If you missed yesterday's broadcast, it is already available thanks to our wizard tech team. It's already available as a 6-hour segment on YouTube, but it will be cut up into more digestible segments in due course. It's a pleasure to be broadcasting to you here from Liverpool, home, of course, to the Beatles, and Derek Yach, our speaker today, is a Beatles fan. Sad, then, that Derek, you can't be here today in Liverpool. Even more sad as it's Paul McCartney's birthday today, so he's 79 today. Happy birthday, Paul. But Liverpool is also important because it played such a significant role in the development of harm reduction in response to HIV back in the late 1980s. Liverpool had the first needle exchange program. It had outreach programs for people who inject drugs and for sex workers, rapid access to safer drugs, including methadone treatment. In fact, the first needle exchange was just a few minutes walk from where we are here. And it was here that the term harm reduction was first used. It was coined by Russell Newcomb, who was a researcher here, and he first used those words in print in 1987. So it's important to sort of recognize that history and how it's affected our thinking about harm reduction through the subsequent decades. Harm reduction was a kind of a brave thing to do, both for the community activists who developed it here, but also for the public health leaders who took considerable risks and had to convince the community and politicians that it was the right thing to do in the face of HIV/AIDS. So jump forward 4 decades, and we're now fighting the battle for the acceptance of tobacco harm reduction. What seemed to me and many others an obvious solution, safer products, safer delivery systems, has faced a huge kickback from the World Health Organization, which supports harm reduction in nearly every field of its work except tobacco, from some public health experts, and kickback from well-funded US and international organizations. So the words harm reduction, which are absent from the International Drugs Conventions, are actually clearly there in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, alongside supply and demand reduction. But harm reduction, as you all know, has been conveniently neglected. So it gives me great pleasure today to welcome Derek Yach, who is one of the architects of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. As most of you will know, Derek is a global health expert and an anti-smoking expert. He is president of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, and the foundation is the only international foundation whose mission is to speed up the switch from smoking. So Derek's presentation today will be followed by a response from Cliff Douglas. Cliff is a long-term expert on a wide range of tobacco-related policy, regulatory and legal issues, including federal regulation of tobacco products and the challenges and potential benefits of e-cigarettes. He directs the University of Michigan Tobacco Research Network, and of late he's become an outspoken proponent of harm reduction and has appealed for an end to what he describes as the internecine warfare over e-cigarettes. So that's enough from me, and over to Derek, who I'll now invite to give the third Michael Russell keynote address for GFN 21. Over to you, Derek.
Thanks, Jerry, and really a pleasure to address you all in Liverpool and worldwide. As I say, particularly as Jerry mentioned on Paul McCartney's birthday. I'm sure, knowing Jerry, that he carefully selected the state, and we know that Liverpool has even deeper roots into the tobacco sector, being one of the central places where a lot of the tobacco was imported, produced, and exported to the empire 100 years ago. Things have changed, and that'll be a theme. It's really a privilege to give this oration in honor of Michael Russell. As I learned from his wife, Audrey, we share so much, but we never met. The University of Cape Town Medical School, swimming, and a lifelong commitment to end smoking. And hopefully here we can all build on his wisdom and his scholarship. We are truly facing a revolution in nicotine technology. Thanks to massive investments in research and patents being filed at a dizzying pace, the ramifications of this intellectual property are being felt in the real world. Already 100 million people are using harm reduction products, and projections suggest that if these tools were more widely available, we would be able to cut the long-term trends of deaths by maybe between 3 and 4 million if we acted more vigorously. Something interestingly, Alan Bloom in The Lancet today comments on when saying that we seem to have so much research, so little action that makes a difference. We know that cessation and harm reduction together are the action that is missing. Clearly, our cultural and political attitudes towards the industry need to be relooked at. Even as bodies like the US FDA and Cochrane recognize the value of harm reduction, the technology faces strong headwinds. Disinformation about nicotine, so well outlined yesterday, and the alleged effects of e-cigarettes have led to policies that explicitly disfavor harm reduction progress, and the public discourse is denied the benefits of this discussion. Moreover, we now have many governments around the world that regulate harm reduction in a manner that is inversely proportionate to risk. We heard from colleagues in Australia how this is the case, as well as in India. Very importantly, we know that policy has lost touch with science. Through serious investment in innovation, industry has created tools that have the potential to create one of the most profound public health shifts in history. Having been involved in global health, I've always been attracted to this issue of tobacco control because we know the gains to public health are the greatest here, greater than almost any other field. And we can do that by eliminating combustible cigarettes. Yet in many respects, the decks appear stacked against change. It's difficult enough to nudge tobacco control groups away from the status quo, let alone to urge the embrace of solutions arising from industry. Indeed, if we were to finally end the use of toxic tobacco products, it'll be necessary to unlearn decades of industry demonization and embrace what the science is telling us. Harm reduction works. In short, the present technological revolution demands an accompanying ideological revolution. Currently, many in tobacco control are skeptical, even hostile towards the contributions of industry. The origins of this hostility are not terribly difficult to identify. You know them well. For generations, the tobacco industry has created products that have killed millions of people. On top of that, industry actors have repeatedly proven themselves dishonest when it comes to scientific research practices. A notable offense, many of you may remember, came in 1954 when a group of tobacco companies published a frank statement to cigarette smokers. This appeared in 400 American newspapers and was anything but frank. The ad claimed that there was a lack of scientific consensus on the damages of smoking, and that what they would do is to investigate these claims through the creation of the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, effectively a PR effort aimed at confusing public understanding of tobacco science. This is what tobacco science meant during the second half of the 20th century, a series of schemes devised to distract and confuse smokers regarding the deadly consequences of using combustible tobacco. But no amount of PR obfuscation could hide the devastation caused by tobacco in the long term. And in fact, Sir Richard Peto famously said that 1 billion people will die this century from tobacco use. The stakes could not be higher. As part of the US Master Settlement Agreement in the 90s between American tobacco companies and attorneys general from 46 states, the industry was forced to disband the so-called research groups. The settlement marked the beginning of a new era in the treatment of industry and endeavors it funds, including and especially research. Throughout the 90s and into the new millennium, anti-industry attitudes and policies became the default. In 2005, the World Health Organization codified this stance via the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and the implementing guidelines of this one clause said there is a fundamental and irreconcilable conflict between tobacco industry's interests and public health interests, an irreconcilable conflict. Today, this assumed conflict is often justified as justification for a hostile attack and attitude toward things industry. Over the past 2 decades, thoughtful and justified action against industry evolved into perfunctory bans, boycotts, and attacks. Ironically, attacks grew more outwardly antagonistic during the very period in which industry began making positive contributions in the field of tobacco control. I want to be very clear. I am under no illusion that the tobacco industry suddenly saw the light and decided to act for the benefit of humanity. Rather, following the events of the 90s, industry did what was necessary to survive. Recognizing a public desire for safer nicotine options, some tobacco executives and companies began prioritizing research into harm reduction. That, at least among a few companies, had been in the works for decades, but never been on the front burner until the start of the century. A few companies made a bet that investment in harm reduction will pay out in the long run. This was a shrewd business decision, and incidentally, it's proving to be an excellent contribution to science and health. Though the transition to safer products remains incomplete, many tobacco companies have diverted resources away from combustibles and towards reduced risk portfolios. For example, the smoke-free portfolio of Swedish Match accounts for over 70% of its operating profit. Similarly, according to recent reports, 28 to 30% of PMI's revenues come from its heated tobacco product, IQOS, and the company hopes this number will reach 50% by 2025. These were the kind of figures that Jonathan Feld told us to focus our attention on yesterday. These are the figures that really matter. Notably, this represents the PMI progress, represents a gradual transition away from legacy tobacco products and the cannibalization of an iconic combustible brand. The start to transformation of the legacy tobacco sector is complemented by innovation among players who started with no tobacco roots. In the United States, we heard how Juul is the most notorious of these companies. In China and Singapore, e-cigarette companies Smoor and Relax have dominated innovation. Though free of the dirty reputation of legacy brands, these companies are responding to the same market demand. Consumers want nicotine products that are not deadly. In this regard, the business goal of these new companies align with a public health goal, namely to destroy the combustible cigarette sector. The fundamental, irreconcilable conflict is giving way to more nuanced realities. Though one might expect the broader public health community to embrace novel nicotine solutions, the response has been, to say at least, pretty bad. This is due largely to entrenched hostility towards industry, as well as the fact that tobacco control community simply did not anticipate industry innovation. Mea culpa. Upon recently reviewing the FCTC text, I was surprised to see that we, communally, failed to mention the importance of intellectual property or patents even once in the text. Then we doubted that a dirty legacy industry would invest in serious R&D. We were wrong. And the latest report from the US Patent Office shows just how wrong we are. What you can see here is that the second largest growth area of all the patents in the US Patent Office are electrical smoking devices, ahead even of machine learning. We will shortly be releasing a new report going into detail on what has been happening in the patent and IP area with regard to tobacco. And the report will actually show 3 things. First, that within large state monopolies, research and patents is focused on improving consumer experiences of combustibles. In other words, making smokers taste better and keeping the death rates high. But the second category, one of the fastest growing, shows that harm reduction innovation is being led by a small number of multinational tobacco companies, along with China-based e-cigarette companies. And finally, it indicates that some multinational tobacco companies are filing patents at developing new therapeutic options for health derived from recent R&D progress. This is fact, this is hard data, this is information on massive amounts of investment. In many respects, the nicotine industry now functions in a manner similar to the pharmaceutical industry. To be sure, they're self-interested and profit-driven. At the same time, they are leaders in scientific innovation and essential to actually address massive health crises. This pharmaceuticalization was aptly summarized in 2017 by Yogi Hale Hendlin and her colleagues in California, who described the phenomenon as the tobacco industry's actual and perceived transition into a pharmaceutical-like industry through the manufacture and sale of non-combustible tobacco and nicotine products for smoking cessation or long-term nicotine maintenance. Whereas Henlon somehow casts this pharmaceuticalization as a bad thing, I take the opposite view. Tobacco companies have in the past few years conducted fundamental clinical and epidemiological research that will be necessary to optimize the safety, efficacy, and desirability of new products. And like a pharmaceutical company, they are completing these exhaustive studies to meet the scientific standards and rigor set by major regulatory bodies, starting with the FDA. To satisfy the FDA's strict rules of evidence, tobacco and e-cigarette companies have conducted extensive peer-review research and have disseminated these findings via monographs and reports. Just some examples. Here you can see the front page of the American Journal of Health Behavior, where Juul has their full range of some of their most recent peer-reviewed research. In addition, you can see the major monograph, several hundred pages, produced by PMI that produces and puts into the public domain research from the past decade. And thirdly, you can see down on the right, one of the latest reports from BAT, highlighting a very large clinical trial and the approaches they are taking to address the underlying science. Clearly, this work amounts to a robust and growing body of evidence that shows the health benefits of harm reduction. The tobacco industry knows the reputational hurdle it must overcome, and as a result, has some of the most robust safety and toxicological data that exist. According to the Foundation analyses, PMI and BAT have published more papers on heated tobacco products than any other research group in the world. Combined, these two companies have in fact published more than the sum total of the next 13 entities, all leading universities. The FDA cannot and does not ignore this evidence. In October 2019, the FDA announced that Swedish Match would be authorized to market its smokeless tobacco as a modified risk tobacco product. In July of last year, it authorized the marketing of IQOS with a reduced exposure in text. This latter decision arrived 3 years after the company shared over 100 million pages of documentation. Further, the authorization was granted under the provision that Philip Morris and others would conduct post-market surveillance to ensure that the products indeed reduce risk and, critically, are not used by kids. Notably, the FDA's exposure modification orders, which permit the marketing of products as containing a reduced level or presenting a reduced exposure to a substance or as being free of that substance, were made because, in the words of the FDA, the products are expected to benefit of the population. These statements represent yet another clear challenge to the irreconcilable difference clause used by WHO to justify a stubbornly undifferentiated anti-industry posture. These authorizations mark an important step in increasing the availability of harm reduction, and the FDA's stamp of approval should inspire global confidence in the state of the science. Sharfstein and others have highlighted their point around this in their discussion of US vaccine approval. They note that the standards of the FDA are so high and the efforts so transparent that its endorsement commands unique respect. The evidence in favor of harm reduction doesn't just rest on the FDA, though, and it's been acknowledged by Cochrane and in more recent months, weeks actually, by the latest report of the Royal College of Physicians. I really urge that all of you read this Royal College of Physicians report that represents 60 years on a sense of where the Royal College believe we should go. Never forget that it was the Royal College of Physicians report of 1962 that alerted the world to the coming pandemic of tobacco. This was before the Surgeon General's report in the US. And that global report set the basis for our modern approaches to tobacco control. Today's report lays out very clearly the values and the importance of addressing harm reduction and the need for risk-proportionate regulation and the role of doctors. We misread that at our peril. All bodies following the science appear to have arrived at all bodies, I would say, that follow the true science, have arrived at the same conclusion. Harm reduction can play an important role in combating the world's tobacco crisis. By contrast, institutions attached more to ideology than evidence remain opposed to innovation in this space. Among those in this camp are journals and academic groups that repeatedly boycott or ban industry research. For instance, and we did hear this yesterday, it's worth repeating, the BMJ announced in 2013 that journals would no longer consider for publication any study that is partly or wholly funded by the tobacco industry. Similarly, Cancer Research UK, the Wellcome Trust, South African Medical Research Council, and others develop policies that bar collaboration with industry scientists. As a result, harm reduction researchers are often excluded from influential meetings, journals, funding opportunities, and institutions. Indeed, there now exist two distinct silos in tobacco research, one in which the evidence for harm reduction is robust and growing, and one in which such evidence does not exist. Foundation analyses of publication trends underscore these parallel universes. Papers in Tobacco Control, a BMJ journal, come exclusively from academics and tend to show the harms of harm reduction. Due to a ban, none of these come from industry. By contrast, 95% of the papers in Regulatory Toxicology and Pharmacology, pretty hard science journal, are from industry, and they show a broader approach, including many benefits. This leads to serious publication bias, particularly given that people tend to read a limited number of journals. In some cases, opponents use Clause 5.3 of the Framework Convention to justify the whole-scale rejection of industry research. This clause is appropriately intended to prevent conflicts of interests among parties to the Framework Convention, which is to say governments, yet has been invoked time and again to justify the banishment of industry-funded people and organizations from a variety of settings where they may make desperately needed contributions. These misuses of 5.3 persist despite very clear implementation guidelines which they created, which stress the need for accountability and transparency, something we all support, and particularly in dealing with the tobacco industry. These guidelines do not mention bans, prohibitions, or boycotts, and they certainly don't endorse the harassment of scientists and abuse too often endured by industry-funded researchers and others in the field of harm reduction. These practices run counter to the principles of open science that increasingly are embraced by researchers, institutions, and nations. For example, the American Library Association's Bill of Rights states that materials should not be excluded because of the origin, background, or views of those contributing to their creation. And UNESCO's recommendation on open science emphasized the importance of inclusiveness, collaboration, and respect. Ad hominem attacks on industry researchers are unacceptable. In addition to lacking in integrity, these practices impede the adoption of measures that could save the lives of current smokers. Clinicians and policymakers need easy access to the full body of science if they are to make informed decisions for clinical care and public policy. As such, progressive anti-industry policies rob experts of the very evidence they need to do their job best for their patients. Well, you might say, what can we do? Despite these headwinds, I remain hopeful that the tide will turn. It always does. One benefit of the outcry against industry and harm reduction science is a reciprocal defense of this research. Forced out of the shadows, harm reduction and industry scientists are now speaking publicly about the value of their research. For instance, writing in the journal Addiction, John Hughes and his colleagues confidently describe why they work with industry. They write, "The goal of tobacco nicotine science should be a reduction in tobacco-related morbidity and mortality. Harm reduction products can play a major role in achieving this goal." Again, the irreconcilable conflict of interest cannot apply if you are saving lives and promoting public health. Additionally, in recent months, courageous academics and young researchers have called for an end to the schism between those supporting harm reduction research and those wedded to the status quo. For instance, Cliff believes it is time to act with integrity and end the internecine warfare over e-cigarettes. Very powerful words packed into one line. Similarly, Donna Carroll and a group of young colleagues worry that the continued promotion of select polarized stances on e-cigarettes will threaten the integrity of research, and she includes the goals and in fact, careers of researchers. And Tamar Anton and colleagues recently noted that ignoring the potential benefits of harm reduction strategies may unintentionally lead to an erosion of trust in tobacco control itself among some members of the public. Select publishers and major societies are also active in closing the gap. For instance, the president of the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco, Megan Piper, recently wrote that SRNT is both a scientific society committed to the open exchange of science, as it should be, and a society that recognizes the harms from commercial combusted tobacco use and tobacco, whose goal it is to profit from addiction to these products. Again, recognizing how one could and should address the irreconcilable conflict. Finally, some scholars are breaking down research silos by working with researchers from, say, the other side. For instance, leading academics, David Abrams, Ray Niora, David Menendez, recently teamed up with industry scientists to publish a paper called The Population Health Impact of Recently Introduced Modified Risk Tobacco Products, published in Nicotine and Tobacco Research. This represents a model of collaboration that places the attainment of health goals above unscientific quibbles. Much more collaboration will be necessary if we are to finally dissolve ideological biases and realize the full public health potential of harm reduction. Hence, we needn't wait vaguely for people to come around, but rather we should take practical steps to promote science-based thinking. To this end, Tom Glynn and others recently described a practical path forward. Their guidelines, worth reading, state that the tobacco control community should focus on eliminating combustible cigarettes, which clearly pose the greatest threat to health. This approach coheres very well with those of Scott Gottlieb and Mitch Zeller, who in 2017 at the FDA proposed a nicotine-based framework for health. And let's remember their words. Nicotine, though not benign, is not directly responsible for tobacco-caused cancer, lung disease, and so on, that kill hundreds of thousands of people. To truly protect the public, the FDA's account must take the account of the continuum of risk for nicotine-containing products. Words that echo the insights and life's work of Mike Russell 4 decades ago. Unfortunately, the data suggests that many public and doctors around the world continue to increasingly believe nicotine is the problem. What I feel we need to do now is to have a new frank statement for our times, a commitment from all parties to prioritize the end of the tobacco epidemic. This would entail at least 5 key commitments. Industry must commit to ending the sale of combustible cigarettes and act accordingly through their investments. Industry must commit to ending youth nicotine use in all forms, and there are many strategies that could be done to achieve that. Industry must commit to sharing IP with companies and countries currently selling combustibles in low middle income countries to ensure that we make these products affordable and available to all. The WHO and governments must commit to revising the Framework Convention to explicitly build a risk-proportionate regulatory system that doesn't require major changes to the text. It requires a bit more thought, building on the very definition of harm reduction, which is in the definition of tobacco control. And finally, never forget that it all starts with the doctors. Leading cancer, tuberculosis, lung, psychiatry, and heart NGOs must commit to science-based strategies for ending smoking among their high-risk patients, being inspired by the advice and approach given by the Royal College of Physicians. All of the above is feasible. It requires the will to actually act. From a scientific perspective, a lot of the hard work has already been done. What remains then is the bigger challenge, which is challenging and changing cultural and political attitudes. And let me end by reminding us, unfortunately with the title of a Bob Dylan song, that if we went back to the 60s, what would we see? We'd see Ringo smoking, George Harrison smoking, and thank you to Audrey Russell for this photograph, Michael and Audrey Russell getting married, and while he was cutting the cake, a cigarette in his mouth. The times indeed are and have changed. We have to change accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek, for such an excellent presentation. Just a reminder for you, those of you watching this through GFN TV, you can post your questions on the question chat line thing there. And those of you in the audience here, I'm sure will be ready for your questions later on. So without more ado, let's pass over to Cliff, who will respond to Derek's talk. Cliff.
Thank you very much, and good morning and good afternoon. I'd like to dive in by acknowledging the conclusion to Derek's remarks. He posited that we need a new frank statement, one for our times that is quite different from the one put forward by the major cigarette companies back in the 1950s. I concur with the goals he outlined, starting with the need for a genuine, clearly demonstrable commitment by industry to ending combustible tobacco use. To my mind, the nature of that commitment does remain in question, although many of the right things are said in light of the industry's ongoing global marketing of combustibles and continued efforts to block policies designed to reduce smoking, such as smoke-free air laws, the elimination of mentholated cigarettes, and nicotine reduction in combustibles. One area that Derek gave particular attention to is the pandemic of misinformation plaguing our dialogue. He noted the terrible irony that there are nations whose policies are more hostile to harm reduction products than to deadly combustibles. Antipathy to industry clearly animates much of this. It's not the only factor, but it's a big one. Derek noted that, and I'm quoting him, industry actors have repeatedly proven themselves dishonest when it comes to scientific research practices. But he also observed that the Master Settlement Agreement of 1998 compelled the dissolution of fraudulent industry-funded research entities, such as the Council for Tobacco Research. I don't think those changes magically transformed the industry, but it was nonetheless an historic transition point and helped move the ball. I served as an attorney in those attorney general cases and have been identified throughout my career as one of those who gave the industry a particularly hard time. But I agree with Derek and many leading scientific researchers, colleagues, that more engagement with industry is needed, and science produced by industry should not be summarily dismissed or canceled, but rather given due consideration under careful peer review with full disclosure of conflicts of interest. And we must continue to seek genuine common ground wherever possible to end the epidemic caused by combustible tobacco use. Let's be inspired by President Biden's 2 messages from Geneva this week, where he said, talk to your adversaries and don't trust, verify. My colleagues in public health should not be afraid to do those things. I'm reminded that my first mentor in tobacco control, Matt Myers, negotiated closely with the industry, which ultimately led to adoption of the MSA. The opportunity now is even greater, as may be the global damage that will result if we fail. Derek also noted that, as he put it, in many respects, the nicotine industry now functions in a manner similar to the pharmaceutical industry. To be sure, he said, they're self-interested and profit-driven. At the same time, however, they are leaders in scientific innovation and absolutely essential to overcoming massive health crises. He quoted UCSF's Yogi Henlin and colleagues, who summarized the concept of pharmaceuticalization as the tobacco industry's actual and perceived transition into a pharmaceutical-like industry through the manufacture and sale of non-combustible tobacco and nicotine products for smoking cessation or long-term nicotine maintenance. That observation brought to mind a conceptualization of the industry that featured prominently in the evidence used in the state attorney general cases and also referenced in the FDA's own original groundbreaking investigation in the 1990s. I'd like now to quote from what Dr. Claude Teague wrote in 1972 when he served as Assistant Director of Research at R.J. Reynolds before he was promoted later to Director of Corporate Research in 1978. This is what he said. In a sense, the tobacco industry may be thought of as being a specialized, highly ritualized, and stylized segment of the pharmaceutical industry. Our industry is then based upon design, manufacture, and sale of attractive dosage forms of nicotine, and our company's position in our industry is determined by our ability to produce dosage forms of nicotine which have more overall value, tangible or intangible, to the consumer than those of our competitors. He went on to say with remarkable prescience that, and I quote, "If our business is fundamentally that of supplying nicotine in useful dosage form, why is it really necessary that allegedly harmful tar accompany that nicotine? There should be some simple, cleaner, more efficient and direct way to provide the desired nicotine dosage than the present system involving combustion of tobacco or even chewing of tobacco. It should be possible to obtain pure nicotine by synthesis or from high nicotine tobacco. It should then be possible using modifications of techniques developed by the pharmaceutical and other industries to deliver that nicotine to the user in efficient, effective, attractive dosage form, accompanied by no tar, gas phase, or other allegedly harmful substances. The dosage form could incorporate various flavorants, enhancers, and like desirable additives, and would be designed to deliver the minimum effective amount of nicotine at the desired release rate to supply the satisfaction desired by the user. Such a product would maximize the benefits derived from nicotine, minimize allegedly undesirable overdosage side effects from nicotine, and eliminate exposure to other materials alleged to be harmful to the user." It was quite a long quote, but I hope you can see why it becomes so relevant today. Because in other words, the industry was interested in potential harm reduction at least half a century ago. While this was wrongly kept from the public and regulators, it signals in hindsight the promise of stressing common ground and sharing scientific understanding in this area within, I would add, a carefully regulated system. I'll conclude with a comment regarding where WHO stands these days, since that is a focus of this session. In connection with the recent World No Tobacco Day, WHO released an article titled "Quit Tobacco to Be a Winner," authored by WHO's Director of Health Promotion. Well, there were a couple of things wrong with that piece, starting with the title itself, which implied that those who are unable to quit are losers, an inadvertently heartless way of identifying addicted cigarette smokers, many of whom are marginalized, less educated, poor, and living with mental illness. Then, following a brief introduction, the article dives into attacking e-cigarettes. Under the subheading, "E-cigarettes are not proven cessation aids," the first thing the author noted was not the scientific evidence, that came later, but rather, and I quote, "that the tobacco industry has continuously attempted to subvert these life-saving public health measures. Over the last decade, the tobacco industry has promoted e-cigarettes as cessation aids under the guises of contributing to global tobacco control." The same article also said switching from conventional tobacco products to e-cigarettes is not quitting. Well, let me simply note that this was a simplistic perspective that, if permitted to stand unchallenged, could cost many people their lives. But there was more. The article went on to quote WHO's Director General, who said that, and I quote, "We must be guided by science and evidence, not the marketing campaigns of the tobacco industry, the same industry that has engaged in decades of lies and deceit to sell products that have killed hundreds of millions of people. E-cigarettes generate toxic chemicals which have been linked to harmful health effects, such as cardiovascular disease and lung disorders." Okay, my undergraduate studies before I went on to study law focused on literary analysis, or the close study of a text, where you interpret its meaning and explore why the author made certain choices. So in my final minute, let's take a very brief, closer look at what the Director General was quoted as saying. He begins with a comment about the importance of science, then pivots to asserting that the choice is between science or tobacco industry marketing. Nothing else and nothing in between those two choices. And then he emphasizes this dichotomy by immediately pointing to the industry's decades of misconduct and the hundreds of millions of deaths that resulted. So at this point, he has framed the choice as being between science and evidence on the one side and fraud and mass casualties on the other. Nothing else and nothing in between those two choices. And then, having painted that picture, he immediately says, without further segue or explanation, that e-cigarettes produce chemicals that cause serious disease. which by proximity to everything else he has said, blends the question of the health effects of e-cigarettes with the hundreds of millions of deaths caused by cigarettes and the deceptive marketing campaigns of big tobacco. It's either that or science and evidence, which leads me to the conclusion, based on this very brief literary analysis, that deliberate or not, this framing constitutes simply an exercise in propaganda, not the rigorous application of science, highlighting that we have our work cut out for us. So in closing, as Derek said following his proposal for a new frank statement, the 5 commitments he outlined are feasible and require a will to action, to take action. He noted that, and I quote, "From a scientific perspective, the hard work has already been done. What remains then is the difficult cultural and political work." I agree, but WHO, for its part, clearly has some distance to travel. And when it comes to the role of industry and our mutual engagement, to repeat, as Joe Biden said, don't trust, verify. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Cliff. We've got 10 minutes for questions. There's a load coming in on the internet, and I know there'll be some from the room. I'm going to start, though, with a question which is quite a personal one, Derek. It says, oh, God, it's just lost it. Hold on. This thing keeps moving around. It's about a person. I've been the subject of, this person says, of an ad hominem attack on my published peer-reviewed journal article. How can I keep up my enthusiasm and not want to give up? So it really cuts to the heart of the way in which FCTC 5.3 is being misused right down to the personal level. So how can people keep up their enthusiasm, Derek, and not want to give up? It's the agony uncle column.
That's the toughest question of the lot. I think we all know and experience it. And unfortunately, I've also experienced it through dialogue with many colleagues in universities on a very regular basis. We all have to do what we think is best. For me, it starts with Paul McCartney's great song, "Here Comes the Sun." And I see the sunrise when I swim in the early morning, and know that it's going to rise the next day and the next day after that. And all we've got to do is just keep going. I know that sounds like the wrong answer people expect, but if you believe you're doing the right thing and you can look in the mirror and ask whether you believe this is ethically the justified step forward, then you're obliged. You're obliged. You don't have a choice to actually act accordingly. I think at the more practical level, because of the careers of young people, and I was particularly worried when I read Donna Carroll and her colleagues' piece about how this has now become an issue in tenure and the very careers of young people around the world. I do believe that we as a community need to take far firmer action against these ad hominem attacks and actually challenge the very institutions that claim they do not support them. In the UK, you are lucky to have some very great institutions, and I think of Nature and the Nature Publishing outfit, the Wellcome Trust, and many others. The Royal College of Physicians, I think those bodies really need to study the evidence clearly and recognize that when they write about ad hominem attacks and harassment in science, the best examples or the worst examples are those occurring in our very field and need to take a stand alongside us, whether or not they agree or disagree with an individual research project or an additional outcome. So I would say that we need that combination of internal resolve, internal community among ourselves to share on a greater basis, and most importantly, external actions by institutions who are committed to open science, transparency, and the end of such harassment in science. We share a lot with other fields of science. I've been watching my friend Peter Hotuz from Texas and the kind of ad hominem attacks he's had on relation to the vaccine. He's been very bold, written outward about it. I really believe that what we need to do is to join forces with people like him and others who are facing the same generic approach, which is a questioning of the science using some moral undertone.
Good, thank you very much. I'm going to take another one online and then have some from the room, and I think we've already got somebody for the next question. There's a lot of comments coming in about FCTC, about 5.3, about the way the COP meeting is dominated by particular interests. And this is the big one, Derek, is what change, it kind of summarizes what a lot of other people are saying here. What changes to FCTC do you believe would help it to support and encourage THR? In other words, in a sense, if you were writing it now, helping to write it now, what would you have done differently, or what needs to be changed in the light of the way in which things have developed since FCT was originally written?
Well, I think there's little rewriting, believe it or not, to do. I think that the text provides provision for updating in the light of science. Remember that a lot of the words that were coded in the beginning were 20 years ago. They followed a meeting where I was responsible for inviting tobacco industry scientists into the hallowed walls of WHO to present on what they believed was coming in harm reduction science. BAT, Philip Morris, and a few others presented at WHO 20 years ago. It was in our minds and our belief that this was going to be useful. Unfortunately, at the time, they didn't have much to present that was too convincing. But the principle of harm reduction and its very wording is in the text. What we really need to be doing is to thinking much more clearly about what does regulate proportionate to risk mean? And in many of the clauses of WHO's framework convention, particularly related, I would say, to tax and pricing, to the way messages and communications happen, and even to smoke-free public places, that is where wording that can be added to the text needs to address how you do this when it comes to harm reduction products, and can even specify what does the spectrum of risk look like, which we now have great details on. I'd say the only other provisions that I think are there, but they haven't been acted on, are those related to R&D for developing countries. There's been virtually zero movement in finding additional funding for research and development for low middle income countries. That was part of the rationale for forming the foundation. The provisions related to farmers, where we're starting to see decline in demand, have never been acted upon by WHO. There've been a lot of words. We're actually taking actual practical steps to help the government of Malawi, the most tobacco-dependent country in the world, to actually address the declining demand that they're going to face. And there are many other provisions which could be activated. I actually don't think that there are substantive changes to the text, and I'd love Cliff's view of it, particularly knowing his focus on text, because I think it's more the interpretation. And the last thing I'd say is that the biggest change needed is for WHO and the Framework Convention to act like other treaty-making bodies. It shouldn't be left to the mavericks in the Secretariat of the Framework Convention to decide how to interpret text. The member states have abrogated their responsibility to actually apply themselves to direct those decisions and not leave them up to, as I say, the mavericks who seem to be out of control in the Framework Convention Secretariat.
Good, thank you. Now we have a question in the room from Robin Gougelet, and this would have to be the last question. We've really literally got 2 minutes left for the session. Robin.
All right, Robin Gougelet, I work with Penny Associates and consult for Jewel Labs. I was just wondering if the two of you could speak on the increased attacks on FDA recently and the politicization of their review of science, particularly science sponsored by tobacco companies as part of their PMTA process.
Let me leave that to Cliff to lead on.
Well, thanks for the very good question, Robin. What's troubling right now is that the FDA is on the cusp of reaching the point where it begins to announce decisions around a great number of pre-market tobacco product applications that have been submitted. This is a process that is taking place right now, looking to come to fruition by September. And it's because the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and other allied health organizations sued to ensure that this process took place. And so efforts to impede FDA's high-level, sophisticated scientific review right now are more than uncalled for. They're interfering with the very regulatory process that my tobacco control community fought so hard to ensure would take place. The FDA has got to be allowed to complete this process to review all of these applications that have come in. There are literally millions of them, and they've staffed up substantially in order to take on this huge task. But they have the expertise, they have the right intent, and they are talking quite openly and clearly about the importance of addressing this in ways that are appropriate for the protection of the public health, and not only protect children, but also serve the needs as appropriate of adult smokers who are unable or unwilling to quit smoking by other means, so that they have access to products that have been carefully reviewed and authorized for public sale and distribution.
Thank you very much, Cliff, and thank you, Derek. I mean, this is an amazing session. We're trying to solve all the problems about tobacco harm reduction in 50 minutes, and that's not going to happen. I think what I take away from today is actually a lot of optimism that there is a dynamic here, there's a trajectory here which is now unstoppable because of the products and the consumer interest, but it's how we can actually get a lot of the obstacles out of the way and how we can speed it up. So Derek, thanks very much for inspiring us today. Cliff, thank you very much for your comments. Thank you everybody online and in the room for attending this session. In the break you will see some comments from our commentary team led by the inimitable, we won't. At lunch, okay, so I've got it wrong, so don't listen to me about the next bit of the program. Look in your program or look online. So a big round of applause from the audience here.